There is something that happened to you, not recently maybe, but at some point in the last few years, where the world didn't change, but the way you stood inside it did. You didn't get an answer. You got a different relationship to the question, and if someone asked you to prove it, to put it in a sentence that would hold up under scrutiny, to explain it the way you'd explain a decision or a diagnosis, you'd find that the words slide away from the thing itself. Not because the thing isn't real, because the tools we were given to describe reality were built for a different layer of it. Here is the paradox this video is going to sit inside of, and I'm going to be honest with you. We're not going to fully resolve it, because it cannot be fully resolved. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way we've been trained to want resolution. 99.9% sure, 0% proven. That number isn't casual. It's the threshold physicists use informally when an effect shows up across experiments, across labs, across decades, when the data keeps pointing at something that doesn't fit any existing frame and yet cannot be dismissed. It's the space between "we can't explain this away" and "we can't yet explain this." That is precisely where quantum manifestation lives. Not in the wishful version, not in the pop science shorthand that turns a genuine frontier of physics into a self-help slogan. In the real version, the uncomfortable one, the one where the evidence is serious, the researchers are credentialed, and the mechanism is still, stubbornly, unknown. What if the thing you've been calling intuition, that sense of inner alignment that seems to precede outer change, is actually physics you haven't been taught yet? That question is the loop this whole video hangs on, and I'm not going to answer it in the first 3 minutes, because any answer I gave you that fast would be smaller than the question deserves. What I will tell you is this: the people most likely to understand what I'm about to walk through aren't the ones who've spent years studying quantum physics. They're the ones who've spent years watching themselves, quietly, without needing applause for it. The ones for whom something shifted, not dramatically but irreversibly, and who have been carrying that shift without quite having language for it. That's who this is for. Not the seekers, the ones who already found something and aren't sure what to call it. There's a specific kind of person who reaches a point in life where the old urgencies just stop working. The drive to prove, to perform, to convince the room, it doesn't disappear exactly. It becomes irrelevant. And in the space that opens up when that urgency drains away, something else moves in. Something quieter. Something that seems to know things before the evidence arrives. Science has a name for part of this. Several names, actually, and none of them are complete. But together, layered, held carefully, without forcing them into a conclusion they don't quite support, they begin to describe a shape that most people in their 40s and 50s and beyond will recognize immediately. Not because they read about it, because they lived it first. This doesn't get resolved in the first minute. That's intentional, because the thing this video is about cannot be grasped by speed. It can only be recognized by someone willing to stay with a question long enough for it to become their own. Here is a problem that doesn't get talked about enough outside of graduate physics seminars, and I think it may be the most important intellectual crisis of the last 100 years. We have two descriptions of reality. Both are mathematically rigorous. Both have been tested thousands of times. Both make predictions that hold up with extraordinary precision, and they are fundamentally, irreconcilably incompatible with each other. The first is classical mechanics, Newton's world refined by Einstein. A world of objects with fixed positions, predictable trajectories, causes that precede effects. A world that exists whether or not you're looking at it. Solid, dependable. The physics of the table you're sitting at, the car you drove today, the body you're living in right now. The second is quantum mechanics, a world where particles don't have fixed positions until they're measured, where two objects can be correlated across any distance instantaneously in ways that have no classical explanation, a phenomenon Einstein called spukhafte Fernwirkung, spooky action at a distance, which has since been confirmed experimentally beyond any serious scientific doubt. A world where the act of observation is not neutral, where the observer and the observed are not cleanly separable. Two worlds, one reality, no bridge. This is called the measurement problem, and it is not a gap that physicists expect to close on a Tuesday afternoon. It is a genuine open wound in our understanding of what exists. The question of how a quantum system, probabilistic, superposed, existing in multiple states simultaneously, collapses into a single definite classical outcome when observed. That question has no agreed-upon answer. There are interpretations. Copenhagen, many worlds, pilot wave, relational, each coherent, each incomplete, each making slightly different predictions about the nature of consciousness and its role in physical reality. And here is where the philosophy enters, unavoidably. If observation collapses possibility into actuality, if the presence of a measuring system, which at its most fundamental level involves something capable of registering a result, participates in the crystallization of physical reality, then the boundary between mind and world is not where we were taught it was. That's not mysticism. That's a direct reading of the math. But here is the philosophical problem underneath the scientific one. And this is the split I want you to hold in your mind for the rest of this video, because it mirrors something most people over 40 have felt in their own lives without ever naming it. We were trained to operate as if we were classical systems, predictable, separate from what we observe. Causes first, effect second. You work harder, you get more. You change your behavior, your circumstances change. Linear, mechanical. A universe of billiard balls where your job is simply to aim better. But there's another mode of operating, one that most people who've been through enough life recognize not from theory but from direct experience, where the change happens at the level of what you are before it shows up in what you do, where the internal reorganization precedes the external shift, sometimes by months, sometimes by years, where you didn't try harder, you became different. And the circumstances rearranged themselves around that difference in ways you could not have engineered deliberately. Not superstition, not wishful thinking, a different physics, operating at a different layer of you. The problem isn't whether this is real. The problem is that we have no agreed-upon framework that accounts for both the classical and the quantum version of the same person, and you are both simultaneously. You live in Newton's world. You are made of planks, and nobody taught you how to operate at the seam between them. This resolves the surface contradiction, two models, both valid, different scales. But it creates a deeper problem. If you are genuinely a system that operates at both levels at once, then the question of what actually causes change in your life just became significantly more complicated than anyone in a productivity seminar has ever admitted. And that deeper problem is where the real inquiry begins. Let me take you somewhere specific, not metaphor, actual history. 1927, Miss Brussels. The Solvay Conference, the most concentrated gathering of scientific genius of the 20th century. Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, Planck, Curie, Schrödinger, Pauli, 29 of the most rigorous minds alive in the same room, arguing about the nature of reality, not philosophy, physics, hard, mathematical, experimental physics. The argument that broke out at that conference has never fully ended. Bohr insisted that quantum mechanics was complete as a description, that asking what a particle is before measurement is simply not a meaningful question. Einstein refused. God does not play dice, he said, meaning there must be a deeper, deterministic layer underneath the probabilistic surface. He spent the rest of his life looking for it. He never found it. What's remarkable, and this is the part that rarely makes it into popular accounts, is that the argument wasn't about the math. Everyone agreed on the math. The argument was about what the math means, about whether reality is observer-dependent at a fundamental level, about whether the universe has a definite state independent of anything capable of registering it. That argument is still open, and in the decades since 1927, the experimental evidence has not moved toward Einstein's position. It has moved carefully and reluctantly toward something stranger. The observer is not innocent. In 1961, physicist Eugene Wigner formalized what is now called the Wigner's friend thought experiment, a logical extension of the measurement problem that places a conscious observer inside the quantum system itself, leading to conclusions that are, by any ordinary intuition, deeply disturbing. If measurement collapses quantum states, and if a registering system is what constitutes a measurement, then two observers can legitimately disagree about whether a physical event has occurred and both be internally consistent within their own reference frames. This was considered a philosophical curiosity for decades. In 2019, a team at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh ran an actual experimental version of the Wigner's friend scenario using photons and beam splitters. The results were consistent with the theoretical prediction: observer-dependent facts. Two measurement records, both physically real, mutually incompatible. Not a thought experiment anymore. A result, in a lab, peer-reviewed. Then there is the Global Consciousness Project, run out of Princeton, begun in 1998, still ongoing. The premise is straightforward, and the implications are unsettling. Random number generators placed at roughly 100 locations around the world produce data that should, statistically, look like pure noise. And mostly it does. But around events of massive collective human attention, September 11th, the death of Princess Diana, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in the hours before it was widely reported, the data shows statistically significant deviations from randomness. Not large deviations, but consistent ones, replicable across events, peer-reviewed, contested, reanalyzed, and still not explained away. The researchers do not claim to know what causes this. They claim only that something is happening that current models do not account for. That is an honest scientific position, and it is, if you follow it seriously, a remarkable one. Because what it suggests, carefully without overclaiming, is that concentrated human consciousness may interact with physical systems in ways that bypass every known mechanism of classical causality. Now add the work of cardiologist and researcher Rollin McCraty at the HeartMath Institute, an organization that, whatever your prior associations with it, has published peer-reviewed research in credible journals and collaborated with institutions including Stanford. McCraty's work on cardiac coherence, coherencia cardiaca, the state in which the heart's electromagnetic rhythm achieves a smooth, ordered pattern rather than a chaotic one, demonstrates something that the language of manifestation has always gestured toward but never precisely named. The heart generates an electromagnetic field measurable up to 3 feet outside the body. That field carries information about the emotional and physiological state of the person generating it. And other biological systems, other people, other organisms, respond to that field in measurable ways, independent of any known sensory channel. No touch, no sound, no visual cue. You are broadcasting, continuously, whether you intend to or not. The mechanism that makes this more than metaphor has a name: entrainment, synchronisation de phase, the tendency of oscillating systems in proximity to synchronize their rhythms over time. It's why grandfather clocks mounted on the same wall will eventually tick together. It's a physical law, not a spiritual claim, and it applies to human electromagnetic fields as directly as it applies to pendulums. Now reach further back, not to physics, but to the interior of the human mind, observed with equal rigor. Carl Jung spent 40 years watching the depths of the psyche and coined the term synchronicity, sincronicidade, to describe events that are meaningfully connected without being causally connected in any classical sense. Two things happen simultaneously. One is internal, a thought, a dream, a sudden conviction. One is external, a phone call, an encounter, a door opening. No mechanism links them, no cause precedes both. And yet the connection is too precise, too contextually loaded, too personally specific to dismiss as coincidence without a certain intellectual dishonesty. Jung didn't claim to have explained this. He claimed only that it happened, repeatedly, across thousands of clinical cases, and that the honest response to something that happens repeatedly is not to discard it, because it doesn't fit your model. The honest response is to question the model. He questioned the model. What connects all of these? Wigner's observer-dependent facts, the Princeton randomness deviations, McCraty's electromagnetic field research, Jung's synchronicity, is not a unified theory. I want to be clear about that, because intellectual honesty matters more here than a satisfying conclusion. What connects them is a pattern, a persistent cross-disciplinary, multi-decade pattern, suggesting that the boundary between interior state and exterior reality is more permeable than classical physics allows. Not dissolved, not non-existent, permeable. And here is the word that keeps appearing across all of these research threads, the word that may be the closest thing to a mechanism that any of this currently has: coherence. Coherencia, the degree to which a system's components are organized, synchronized, operating in phase rather than in opposition to each other. Coherence is not belief. Coherence is not positive thinking. Coherence is a measurable physical state. In cardiac rhythms, in brainwave patterns, in the electromagnetic output of a biological system that has resolved its internal contradictions enough to oscillate in an ordered way. And the hypothesis, serious, peer-adjacent, not yet mainstream but not fringe either, is that coherence is the actual mechanism, not visualization, not affirmation, not the specific content of what you want, but the degree to which the system that is you is operating in an integrated, non-contradictory, phase-aligned state when it meets the world. That hypothesis doesn't prove quantum manifestation, but it reframes the question entirely. The question stops being, does the universe respond to my wishes? That's a question built for a classical billiard ball model of reality, and it's the wrong question, which is why it never gets a satisfying answer. The real question becomes, what happens to the field of probability around a coherent biological system? And that question, that one, the data is beginning to take seriously. This is where the evidence sits, not at the level of proof, not at the level of dismissal, but at that precise, uncomfortable threshold where the rigorous and the inexplicable keep finding each other across decades of independent inquiry. The data exists, the researchers exist. The results persist through replication attempts and critical analysis. What doesn't exist yet is the framework that holds it all in one place without distorting any individual piece of it. That framework may come, or it may be that some layers of reality are constitutionally resistant to the kind of third-person, observer-neutral description that science requires, because those layers are, by their nature, first-person all the way down. The data alone will never be enough for the person who needs proof before they allow the shift to mean something. And that is not a scientific problem. That is a psychological one, which brings us to the layer of this that no experiment can touch. The layer where most of you reading this have actually been living. There is a specific kind of change that happens to people in the second half of life that has no good name in ordinary language. It's not a breakdown, though it can feel like one from the inside. It's not an awakening, though that word gets used because nothing else fits. It's not wisdom exactly, not the accumulated experience kind that you can point to and explain. It's something more structural than any of those, something that happens at the level of what you use to perceive, rather than at the level of what you perceive. You've probably noticed it in a few specific ways. The things that used to be urgent, the social comparisons, the need to be seen as competent, the low-grade performance that most of us run constantly without realizing it, they start to feel not wrong exactly, but strangely beside the point. Like wearing a coat indoors in summer. You can do it, you just can't quite remember why it seemed necessary. And in the space that opens when that coat comes off, something changes about how you relate to what happens around you. Not passivity. This isn't resignation or detachment in the numb sense. It's more like the difference between watching a river from the bank and understanding for the first time that you were always already in the water. The movement was always there. You just stopped fighting the current long enough to feel which way it was actually going. That's not metaphor. That's a description of a real neurological process. Here is what the neuroscience of midlife actually shows, stripped of the cultural narrative that frames it as decline. The prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with executive function, planning, social monitoring, and the management of what other people think of you, undergoes a gradual shift in dominance across the fourth and fifth decades of life. Not deterioration, reorganization. The brain begins to allocate less metabolic energy to the constant social threat scanning that consumes enormous resources in younger adults and more to integrative processing, the kind of thinking that connects disparate information into pattern, that tolerates ambiguity without resolving it prematurely, that recognizes meaning rather than just cataloging facts. Psychologist David Stripe called this post-formal thinking, the cognitive capacity that emerges when the brain stops needing every problem to have a single correct answer and starts being able to hold contradiction without collapsing it. It's not a loss of rigor, it's an expansion of the kinds of problems the mind can sit with comfortably. And here is what's interesting about post-formal thinking. In the context of everything we've just covered, it is, structurally, the cognitive equivalent of coherence. A mind that can hold contradiction without forcing premature resolution, that can remain open and organized simultaneously, is a mind operating in something closer to the quantum description of reality than the classical one. Not because it understands quantum physics, because it has, through experience and loss and enough cycles of being wrong, learned to stay with uncertainty the way a quantum system stays in superposition. Multiple states, not yet collapsed, not yet forced into a single definite outcome. You didn't study your way into this. You lived your way into it. Have you noticed that the things that used to derail you, the criticism, the setback, the plan that fell apart, land differently now? Not that they don't land. They do. But the recovery is faster. The meaning you assign to them is looser, less total. You used to take a professional failure as evidence about your fundamental worth. Now you're more likely to take it as information about a specific situation, file it, and keep moving. That's not emotional suppression. That's not cynicism. That's a different nervous system. The polyvagal theory, developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges and now widely applied in trauma research, describes the autonomic nervous system not as a simple on-off stress switch, but as a sophisticated three-level hierarchy. At the top, the ventral vagal state, estado vagal ventral, characterized by social engagement, curiosity, creative openness, and physiological calm. This is the state in which the heart's electromagnetic field, as McCraty's research shows, is most likely to be coherent. This is the state in which, if any of the quantum-adjacent phenomena we discussed in the last section are real, you are most likely to be operating as a signal rather than as noise. The shift that people in midlife describe, that sense of operating from a different level, of perceiving rather than just reacting, of somehow knowing things before the evidence assembles itself, may not be spiritual gift. It may be the natural result of a nervous system that has, through enough experience, learned to default to ventral vagal regulation. That has stopped spending its resources on social threat monitoring and started spending them on something that functions, from the outside, a lot like receptivity, not the passive kind, the tuned kind. Like an antenna that has stopped generating static long enough to receive a signal, it was always capable of picking up. The signal didn't get stronger, the noise got quieter. And in that quieter field, things that were always there, patterns, connections, a kind of knowing that arrives without a traceable source, become legible in a way they simply weren't before. This is recognizable. I suspect you recognized it somewhere in the last 3 paragraphs without me having to spell it out. And that recognition itself is data, not scientific data in the peer-reviewed sense, but the kind of data that a well-calibrated instrument produces when it encounters something it was built to detect. The question isn't whether you recognize it. The question is whether you trust what you recognize. And that question, that specific tension between recognition and trust, is where most people stall. Not because the shift isn't real, because the cultural framework they were handed doesn't have a slot for it. There's no official category for my inner state seems to precede and shape my outer circumstances in ways I can't fully explain, but also can't honestly dismiss. There's no checkbox on any form that says, I am operating differently at a level I don't have language for. So people do one of two things. They either reach for the spiritual vocabulary, manifestation, law of attraction, the universe conspiring, and get the recognition without the rigor, the comfort without the precision, or they dismiss the whole thing as pattern matching and coincidence bias, and get the rigor without the recognition, the precision without the honesty, not mysticism, not dismissal, something more demanding than either. What this block has been building toward, and what I want you to hold as we go deeper, is that the change you've already undergone is not preparation for understanding what comes next. It is itself the thing being described. The reorganization of your nervous system, the quieting of your social threat circuitry, the expansion into post-formal cognition, the default toward ventral vagal regulation. These are not metaphors for coherence. They are coherence. You didn't read about this and then apply it. You lived through enough to arrive at it. And that sequence, experience first, framework second, is exactly the sequence that the evidence, as we're about to see, suggests is the correct one. This resolves something. The shift you felt is real, neurologically and physiologically grounded, not imagined. But it creates a larger problem. Because if coherence is the mechanism, if your internal state is genuinely functioning as a kind of field that interacts with probability in ways the data is beginning to take seriously, then the question of how you maintain that state, how you protect it, how you deepen it without turning it into another performance, that question just became the most important practical question you have. And that's exactly where we need to go next. I want to slow down here, because this is the section where the temptation is to get either too technical or too poetic, and both of those moves would be dishonest. Too technical, and it becomes a lecture that keeps you at arm's length from the thing itself. Too poetic, and it slides into the kind of language that sounds profound but commits to nothing. So let's stay in the middle, precise and close at the same time. You are not at your most fundamental physical level, a solid object moving through space. You are a process, a dynamic, self-organizing, electrochemical and electromagnetic process that happens to have enough structural continuity to feel like a thing rather than an event. The atoms that constitute your body right now are not the atoms that constituted it 7 years ago. The neural pathways firing as you process this sentence are being subtly modified by the processing itself. You are, at every level of description available to current science, a system in continuous flux that produces, as a byproduct of its operation, a measurable field extending beyond its physical boundaries. That field is not incidental. It is you, expressed at a different scale. The heart's electromagnetic field, the one McCraty's research documented, is the strongest rhythmic electromagnetic field the body produces. It is approximately 60 times greater in amplitude than the brain's electrical activity, and it permeates every cell in the body before extending outward into the space around you. Its waveform carries real-time information about your physiological and emotional state. It changes measurably when your emotional state changes. It changes measurably when you shift from anxiety to calm, from contracted to open, from defended to present. This is not subtle. This is not the kind of effect that requires sensitive instruments to detect in principle while remaining undetectable in practice. People respond to it. Animals respond to it. It affects the people in the same room with you in ways they cannot consciously identify, but that register in their own autonomic nervous systems, shifting their heart rate variability, their cortisol levels, their own capacity for coherent regulation, without a single word being spoken. You've experienced this. You've walked into a room and known within seconds something about the emotional state of the people in it that no one told you. You've been around someone who was visibly calm and found your own breathing slow without deciding to slow it. You've had a conversation with someone whose anxiety was contained, professionally, socially contained, and left that conversation inexplicably tense, carrying something that wasn't yours when you arrived. That's not empathy as metaphor. That's field entrainment as physics. And now here is where we reach the second peak of this inquiry, the place where the pieces we've been assembling begin to cohere into something that is more than the sum of its parts. Rupert Sheldrake, a Cambridge-trained biochemist whose career took a turn that made him deeply controversial, and I would argue deeply important, proposed in 1981 what he called morphic resonance, resonantia morphica, the hypothesis that biological systems are shaped not only by their genetic inheritance and local chemistry, but by a kind of field memory accumulated by similar systems across time, that the form and behavior of living organisms is influenced by what similar organisms have done before, not through any known physical signal, but through a resonant connection that operates outside of classical spatial and temporal constraints. This hypothesis is not accepted by mainstream biology. I want to be completely clear about that. It is also not refuted. It has not been experimentally falsified, in part because the experiments required to test it properly sit at the edge of what current methodology can manage, and in part because the scientific community's resistance to the implications has, fairly or unfairly, limited the institutional support available for that testing. What Sheldrake's hypothesis offers, regardless of whether it is ultimately confirmed, is a framework for something that the data keeps bumping into from multiple directions. The possibility that information is not only stored locally in individual brains and bodies, but distributed across fields that connect similar systems across time and space. Not magic, a different kind of memory. Consider what this would mean for the shift we've been describing. If a sufficient number of people have undergone the reorganization we discussed in the last block, the neurological maturation, the coherence shift, the move from reactive to receptive, and if Sheldrake's framework has even partial validity, then that accumulated pattern becomes easier to access for anyone whose system is tuned to receive it. The path gets worn into the field. The transition becomes, across generations and populations, progressively more available, not inevitable, not automatic, available. Now layer onto this the work of physicist David Bohm, Einstein's colleague, one of the most original scientific minds of the 20th century, a man whose credentials were beyond serious dispute, who spent the latter part of his career developing what he called the implicate order, ordem implicata, the idea that beneath the explicit, visible, measurable layer of reality lies an enfolded order in which everything is connected to everything else, and what we observe as separate objects. And events are local unfoldings of a deeper wholeness. Bohm was not making a spiritual claim. He was making a physical one, grounded in his interpretation of quantum field theory. He was saying that the separateness we observe is real at one level of description and illusory at another. That locality, the property of being here rather than there, is an emergent feature of a deeper, non-local reality. What this means for the question this video has been holding. If Bohm is even directionally correct, then the idea that your internal state is separate from external circumstances is a description that is accurate at one scale and incomplete at another. At the scale of everyday life, Newton's world, you are separate from what happens around you, and effort and behavior are the only legitimate levers. At the deeper scale, at Bohm's implicate order, the boundary between your state and your field of experience is not a wall, but a membrane, permeable, responsive, organized by the coherence of what's doing the perceiving. This is not an invitation to passivity. Bohm himself was emphatic about this. The implicate order is not a cosmic vending machine. It is a description of the relational structure of reality, one in which what you are at the level of your fundamental electromagnetic and informational signature participates in the shaping of what unfolds around you. Participates, not controls. There is a difference between those two words that most conversations about manifestation have never been honest enough to hold. Control implies a mechanism you can operate deliberately, reliably, on demand. A lever you pull and a result that follows. That's the classical model again, Newton dressed in spiritual clothing. And the reason the pop science version of manifestation feels hollow to anyone who thinks carefully about it is precisely because it promises control, while the actual evidence only ever points toward participation. Participation is messier. Participation means your coherence influences probability without determining outcome. It means you are a variable in an equation that has other variables you cannot see and do not govern. It means the shift is real and the results are not guaranteed, and that both of those things are true simultaneously without contradiction. That's harder to sell. It's also actually true. Now let's bring this to the sharpest point this section can reach. If you are a field, electromagnetic, informational, organized by your dominant emotional and physiological state, then the question of manifestation stops being about technique and starts being about signal quality. Not what you're asking for, not how specifically you visualize it, not which affirmation you repeat. What is the quality of the signal you are continuously broadcasting? Because here is what the entrainment research, the cardiac coherence data, Bohm's implicate order, and even the peripheral evidence from the Global Consciousness Project all point toward when you hold them together, without forcing them into a unified theory they don't quite support. Coherent systems influence their environment. Incoherent systems generate noise that cancels itself. The difference between a system that participates effectively in shaping its field of experience and one that doesn't is not the content of its intentions. It's the degree to which it is integrated. Integrated meaning, not performing one thing while being another, not broadcasting calm while generating fear internally, not affirming abundance while every cell of the autonomic nervous system is scanning for threat, not visualizing connection while the electromagnetic field is transmitting contraction. The incoherence isn't moral failure, it's physics. A signal divided against itself attenuates. A signal that is what it claims to be, all the way down through the layers, carries. This is why people who have gone through genuine transformation, not performance of transformation, not spiritual identity adoption, but the real metabolized kind that comes from loss and time and enough cycles of being completely wrong, often describe a shift in what seems to find them, not because they mastered a technique, because the noise cleared, because the system became, gradually and without drama, more of what it already was at its most integrated, less divided, more itself. And a system that is more fully itself is, by the physics we've been discussing, a more coherent emitter, a cleaner signal, a field that influences its environment not by demanding specific outcomes, but by carrying a specific quality of organization that other systems, people, circumstances, opportunities, entrain to. This is where the second peak resolves, not into certainty, but into something more useful than certainty. Into a framework that is precise enough to work with, humble enough to be honest, and grounded enough in actual research that you don't have to choose between taking it seriously and taking yourself seriously. You are a field. That field has measurable properties. Those properties are shaped by your dominant state. Your dominant state is not fixed. It is the result of decades of experience acting on a nervous system that is, if you've been paying attention, still reorganizing, still integrating, still becoming more coherent in ways that are neurologically, electromagnetically, and possibly, the data is careful here, and so should we be, quantum mechanically consequential. This resolves the question of mechanism, at least provisionally. But it opens something harder. If coherence is what you're actually working with, then the things most people use to measure whether manifestation is working, external results, timelines, specific outcomes, are the wrong instruments. And using the wrong instrument to measure a real phenomenon will always produce the conclusion that the phenomenon isn't there. What, then, is the right instrument? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the question the next section is going to answer directly, by naming what's actually happening in the people for whom this is unmistakably real. Let me step out of the framework for a moment, not because the framework isn't useful, it is, but because there's a specific kind of person watching this video, and I think I know something about where they are right now, and I'd rather speak to that directly than keep building architecture around it. You've been through something, maybe more than one something, the kind of thing that doesn't leave you where it found you, not because you processed it perfectly or emerged from it healed in any clean sense, but because the sheer weight of it rearranged something structural, something in the way you process experience, something in what you find important and what you find you simply cannot make yourself care about anymore, no matter how much social pressure suggests you should. And somewhere in the aftermath of that rearrangement, things started happening that didn't fit the model you'd been given. Connections that appeared at the precise moment they were needed. Decisions made from a place of internal knowing rather than external logic that turned out against every rational expectation to be exactly right. A quality of attention in your life that began to feel less like you were pursuing things and more like the right things were finding you. Not always, not magically, not without effort, but with a frequency and a specificity that the word coincidence stopped being adequate to describe. You didn't advertise this. You learned quickly that trying to talk about it in ordinary social contexts produces a very specific kind of polite discomfort in the people listening, the kind that tells you they've filed what you said under a category that doesn't quite fit, and that pursuing the conversation further will cost more than it returns. So you kept it mostly to yourself. That was wise, and it was also lonely. Here is what I want to say to that. The loneliness of carrying a real experience that the available language keeps distorting is one of the more specific kinds of isolation that the second half of life produces. It's not the loneliness of being misunderstood in a general sense. It's the loneliness of having arrived somewhere real and finding that the maps for that territory were all drawn by people who hadn't been there yet. You are not confused. You are not inflating ordinary coincidence into cosmic significance because you need comfort. You are not bypassing critical thinking with wishful belief. You are operating at a level of integration that most of the cultural frameworks around you were not built to describe. That's not grandiosity, that's just an accurate assessment of the gap. The right instrument for measuring whether coherence is working, the question I left open at the end of the last section, is not external outcome. It's not whether the thing you wanted arrived on schedule. It's something more interior and more honest than that. It's whether you are more fully yourself than you were, whether the signal has less static in it than it did, whether the gap between what you are internally and what you project externally has been narrowing, not because you've gotten better at performance, but because the need for performance has genuinely, metabolically reduced. That's measurable, not with instruments, with the quality of your own attention to your own experience over time. And if the answer is yes, if you recognize honestly and without inflation that the signal has been getting cleaner, then what the evidence we covered earlier suggests is that you are, right now in this period of your life, operating closer to the kind of coherent field state that the data keeps pointing toward as the actual mechanism. Not because you did the spiritual work correctly, because you lived long enough and honestly enough to arrive here. The exhaustion you may have felt, the specific tiredness of trying to prove to yourself and others that this is real, of translating your experience back into frameworks that keep reducing it, of managing the gap between what you know from the inside and what you can defend from the outside. That exhaustion is itself information. It's the signal telling you that the translation work is no longer the task. The task now is something different, something that requires not more explanation, but more trust in the instrument you've already become. This doesn't close the loop fully, because the loop this whole conversation has been running isn't actually about whether the shift is real. You already know it's real. The loop is about what you do now, knowing what you know, being what you've become. And that's exactly where we need to finish. We started with a question, not a comfortable one, a precise one. What if the thing you've been calling intuition is actually physics you haven't been taught yet? We've been carrying that question for the entire length of this conversation, and I told you at the beginning that I wouldn't answer it quickly, because a fast answer would be smaller than the question deserves. We've covered the ground now. We've looked at the measurement problem and Rigner's observer-dependent facts. We've sat with the Global Consciousness Project data and McCraty's cardiac field research. We've traced the arc from Jung's synchronicity through Sheldrake's morphic resonance to Boehm's implicate order. We've looked at what happens neurologically in the second half of life, at postformal cognition and ventral vagal regulation, and the quieting of the social threat circuitry that frees up the system for something more integrative. Now I'll answer the question. Not with certainty, because certainty would be dishonest, and this entire inquiry has been predicated on the idea that honesty matters more than comfort, but with the precision that the evidence actually supports. Intuition is coherence, recognizing pattern across scales it cannot consciously access. That's not mysticism dressed in scientific language. That's a direct description of what the data points toward. A biological system that has achieved sufficient internal integration, whose electromagnetic output is ordered rather than chaotic, whose nervous system defaults to receptive rather than defensive, whose cognitive architecture has expanded to hold complexity without premature resolution. That system has access to information that a less integrated system, generating more internal noise, cannot detect. Not supernatural information, not information from outside the known universe. Information that was always present in the field, in the pattern, in the texture of the situation, but that required a sufficiently quiet, sufficiently coherent receiver to register it. The signal was always there. You became the instrument capable of receiving it. This is why the people who describe reliable intuition as a feature of their lives are almost never the young and untroubled. They are almost always people who have been through enough, loss, failure, the specific humility of being completely wrong about something that mattered, to have had their internal noise substantially reduced by reality itself. Not by technique, by life, doing what life does to systems that stay open to it long enough. And this is the payoff that the whole inquiry has been building toward, the thing that closes the loop opened in the very first minute. Quantum manifestation in its honest form is not about learning to want things correctly. It's not about visualization frequency or gratitude journaling or the specific wording of an intention. Those things may have value as practices that support coherence, as tools that help the nervous system settle, that redirect attention from threat to possibility. that gently nudge the electromagnetic field toward a more ordered state. But they are not the mechanism. You are the mechanism. The coherent, integrated post-noise version of you that has emerged from everything you've survived and metabolized and refused to let make you smaller. That is the actual instrument of whatever it is that the data is pointing toward. Not a technique you apply, a state you inhabit. Not something you do on Tuesday mornings with a journal. Something you are increasingly as the decades do their work on a system that keeps choosing integration over performance. The 99% certainty in the title of this video is not scientific confidence in a specific mechanism. It's the honest assessment of a pattern, cross-disciplinary, multi-decade, persistently appearing at the edges of what current frameworks can contain, that cannot be explained away without a level of motivated reasoning that itself requires explanation. Something is happening at the boundary between interior state and exterior reality. The mechanism is not proven. The pattern is undeniable. And you, specifically you at this point in your life, with this particular nervous system that has been shaped by this particular accumulation of experience, are not waiting for the proof to arrive before you trust what you've already found. That's not faith in the religious sense. That's something more rigorous than faith and more honest than skepticism. It's the recognition that you have been, all along, both the experiment and the evidence. That the shift you felt and couldn't name and carried quietly through years of inadequate frameworks was not a departure from reality. It was a more accurate contact with it. The physics caught up. You were already there. If something in this video landed, not as information but as recognition, I'd ask you to do one thing before you move on to whatever comes next. Don't explain it to anyone today, not because it isn't worth sharing, because the thing that just landed needs a little time to settle into its own shape before language touches it again. The moment you try to translate it for someone else, you'll reach for the available frameworks. And the available frameworks, as we've spent the last hour establishing, are not quite adequate to the thing itself. Give it a day. Let it be yours first. If you want to go further, if the questions this opened feel like ones you want to keep pulling on, the next video in this series goes deeper into the specific relationship between nervous system state and what researchers are beginning to call field influence. The measurable ways in which a coherent biological system affects probability distributions in its immediate environment. It's more specific, more technical in places, and more demanding. It's also, I think, the most important thing I've put together on this topic. The link is here, no pressure. Only if the thread is still live for you, and if this video found you at a moment when the question it's asking is one you've been living with for a long time. If you've been carrying this quietly without adequate language, wondering whether the thing you've been experiencing is real or whether you've simply been too willing to find meaning in pattern, leave that in the comments. Not as a question looking for reassurance, as a data point, because the accumulation of people who have arrived at the same recognitions through entirely different paths and entirely different lives is itself a kind of evidence that no single experiment can produce. You are not alone in having found this. The science is 99.9% sure something is happening at the boundary between who you are and what unfolds around you. You've been sure longer than the science has. Trust the instrument you've become.